Sandra Bullock, schools, arrogant journalist. Her response, leaves studio silent. Sandra Bullock, silences an atheist journalist. Her response, left America speechless. The studio was silent. But this wasn't a peaceful silence. Tension hung in the air like an invisible smoke, unseen beneath the lights. Cameras were rolling, directors were whispering, and millions of people were waiting in front of their screens. Tonight, a moment that would go down in television history was about to happen. Sandra Bullock carefully scanned her surroundings from where she sat. The chill of the space seemed to seep into her skin. Despite the studio's modern, minimalist design, there was an unmistakable tension in the air. The man across from her, Alan Brooks, was watching her intently, as always. He was slightly leaned forward, like a hunter eyeing his still prey. Who would make the first move? Alan narrowed his eyes, tapping his pen on the table rhythmically. "Sandra," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "For years, you've been one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces. But in recent interviews, you've started talking about faith, values, and people's inner worlds. Why?" The lights in the studio seemed even brighter now. The audience was holding its breath, waiting for the answer. Sandra paused for a brief moment. Instead of revealing what was on her mind, she chose to conceal it. She tilted her head slightly, a faint, mysterious smile appearing at the corners of her lips. Alan tapped his pen lightly on the table. He was waiting that moment. The moment when everyone in front of the screen leaned in a little more, holding their breath. And Sandra opened her mouth to answer. The screen went black. Silence was broken by the subtle smile that formed on Alan Brooks' lips. "You've been in front of the camera for so long, but in recent years, you've started taking on a different role, haven't you?" he said, his voice measured and cold. "People know you as an actress, but now you're talking about faith. Why?" Sandra Bullock didn't take her eyes off him. The question seemed simple, but there was a hidden knife in it. Alan wasn't asking out of genuine curiosity. He was searching for a gap, a crack. The studio lights illuminated her face, but the tension in the air was more palpable than anything else. The audience was fixated on the screen. Even the producers and technical crew were waiting without moving. Sandra took a deep breath. This wasn't a movie set. There was no script, no lines here. But, as with every moment she stepped on stage, her instincts guided her. "Then let me ask you a question, Alan," she said, her voice soft but clear. She tilted her head slightly, her smile remaining gracefully in place. "What do people hold on to when science can't provide them with the answers?" Alan narrowed his eyes. He felt the weight of the question, but didn't let it show. His face remained unchanged as he slowly twirled the pen between his fingers. "Do you think," he said, his voice still cool, "science isn't enough for people?" Sandra didn't immediately answer. The few seconds of silence stretched out, like a tense string pulled across the studio. "What science can do is incredible," she said finally. "But it can't bring back the things a person loses, can it?" Alan dropped the pen. The questions hanging in the studio were now palpable. This silence wasn't a trap this time. It was the sign of an unexpected move. Alan slowly set the pen down on the table. It was a brief motion, but something in the air shifted. "Do you think," he said, his voice as cool as ever, "science isn't enough for people?" Sandra Bullock tilted her head slightly. Her eyes sparkled for a moment in the bright lights of the cameras. The question was simple, but it carried a deep challenge. "What science can do is incredible," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But can it bring back the things a person loses, Alan?" Another silence fell over the studio. This time, the silence wasn't just a pause. It was a space that penetrated into the audience. Alan leaned back slightly in his chair, as if preparing to respond, but Sandra acted first. "Look, Alan," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "I could present an argument to you. We could talk about the historical balance between science and faith. But you know what? People don't get convinced by theories. People change through stories." Alan squinted his eyes and looked at her. This was a move. Unexpected, uncalculated. Sandra clasped her fingers together gently, placing them on the table. "So, let me tell you about someone," she said. "Her name is Margaret." The tension in the air changed in an instant. The technical crew didn't move. The producers held their breath. The audience leaned in a little closer to the screen. "I met Margaret 12 years ago," Sandra continued. "At the time, I wasn't a political figure. I wasn't doing talk shows. I was just focused on my work. But Margaret, she changed my life." Alan remained silent. Now, only Sandra's voice filled the room. Something was happening. Something was changing. Alan Brooks didn't pull his hand away from the table, but for a brief moment, he averted his eyes. It was a small but critical move, like someone lowering their shield in the middle of a battle. "Who was Margaret?" he asked, his voice softer now. Sandra Bullock took a slight, deep breath. This wasn't an easy story to tell, but some stories, no matter how difficult, needed to be told. "I met her 12 years ago," she said, her voice carrying an unusual calm. Margaret was a 72-year-old woman. She had spent much of her life losing the people she loved. The studio was completely still. Even Alan waited without commenting. "Her first son died of cancer," Sandra continued. Her tone hadn't changed, but the weight in the air grew heavier. "Her second son died in a car accident. Her husband, years later, had a stroke, and she never got to say goodbye before he passed." Alan dropped his pen. This wasn't the kind of speech he had been prepared for. Sandra continued. "I asked her, how could she still be so calm? How could she still wake up every morning?" Alan leaned in, paying closer attention. "What did she say?" Sandra lifted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming under the light. "Because I'm still here," Margaret said. "And I believe there's a reason I'm still here." Silence. The tension in the air had shifted, but it wasn't a frightening silence. It was a deep silence. One of those moments where all you can do is think. Alan cleared his throat, but he didn't speak. For the first time, Sandra wasn't cornering him. For the first time, she wasn't trying to prove anything to him. She was just telling a story. And that was breaking Alan's script. Alan leaned back slightly in his chair. He had a question, but he didn't ask it. For the first time, it was clear he was truly thinking. Sandra noticed. She tilted her head slightly. "When people experience pain, loss, and uncertainty, Alan," she said, her voice low but clear, "facts aren't enough. Sometimes what keeps a person going is beyond the truth." The cameras kept rolling, but Alan was still silent. Alan Brooks leaned back slightly in his chair. The movement was small, but the impact was large. He looked at the papers in front of him, lightly tapping his fingers on the table, then turned his eyes to Sandra, as if none of it mattered. "So," he said, his voice still measured but a little slower, "was this just the faith of one woman, or do you, like Margaret, think the same way?" Sandra Bullock looked at him. This was Alan's classic move, not just questioning the story, but questioning the storyteller. She shrugged slightly, took a deep breath. She had an answer. but it wouldn't be the kind of answer Alan was looking for. "What do you think people do, Alan?" she asked. "When a storm has wrecked their lives? When a doctor says, 'This is all we can do'? When science can only shrug its shoulders?" Alan's lip curled slightly. It was a sign he was thinking, but he was still trying to maintain control. "People cling to something in desperation," Alan said. "But that doesn't prove that thing is real." Sandra smiled lightly, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was more the expression of someone who had understood something. "Okay, Alan," she said, leaning slightly on the table. "What do you think about hope?" Alan raised his eyebrows slightly. "What do you mean?" Sandra briefly lowered her eyes, then looked back at him. "Hope can't be measured," she said. "You can't put it under a microscope. You can't calculate it with math. But still, people believe in hope." There was a hum in the studio, but no one spoke. It was as if everyone was weighing the weight of these words. Alan blinked, a small movement, but a long enough pause to be noticed. Sandra noticed this. "And now, you're not going to sit here and tell me hope is an illusion, are you?" Alan took a deep breath. It was as if he were weighing his response. But for the first time, the words weren't coming to him as easily as he wanted. The closing music of the show began to play softly. The host came in. "Tonight, we witnessed an incredible conversation," he said. "And I think many people will be thinking about what was discussed here for a long time." As the cameras turned off, Alan Brooks stood up from his chair. He always did this, but this time his movement was slower. Sandra was still sitting. There was a faint hum in the studio, but this didn't feel like a typical show ending. People seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to move. Phones started vibrating. Twitter, Instagram, news sites. The first clips had already gone live. But what caught Sandra's attention most was Alan Brooks's silence on social media. Normally, he would be the first to comment after the show. But this time, hours passed, and he hadn't written anything. Until 8:37 a.m. the next morning, he shared one sentence. "I left last night with more questions than I came with. And that's where the real story began. And if this story made you think, if it stirred something inside you, don't let it end here. Keep asking questions. Keep searching. Keep listening. Because sometimes the answers don't come from winning an argument, but from real conversations. Don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. We're here for more.